Hello everybody, and welcome, a very warm welcome to you today, and it's nice to see so many of you have come along to hear our special speaker today, the Reverend Dr. Gregory Jenks. To you, Greg, thank you very much for coming down from Queensland, all the way from Queensland to be with us, and we look forward to hearing about your thoughts and some questions later on. Welcome to you. To PCNV in Melbourne, thank you very much for helping us with this day and bringing PCNV officially to Geelong. And a particular mention to Lorraine Parkinson and John Bodicum, who've been down here a couple of times and given our small Geelong group a lot of encouragement. And I don't know where they are, but we've really appreciated your input to our group, and we look forward to meeting you again in the future and having other people who can come along and make life interesting for us, because we don't like being too sedentary. We like to move things and we like to talk about things. Welcome to all those people from Geelong area. I think there's probably a few from this particular church, St Luke's, that I don't know you, so if you get a chance afterwards, I'd love to meet you. And a final welcome to our own little Geelong group. We call ourselves the Open Christianity PCNV group, and we meet occasionally, as one of our members, Jeff, will explain later in the day. So, thank you very much for coming along, and we do look forward to an input from you with some questions later. And now I'd like to throw to Dick Carter from Melbourne PCNV, who's going to run the day for us. Reverend Dick, when you're here, thank you, Dick.
Thank you, Doug. Good afternoon, everybody. The PCNV is the Progressive Christian Network of Victoria. The committee was conscious of the fact that until this meeting, all of our meetings previously have been held in Melbourne. But we are fortunate enough to have a significant proportion of our members who live in the country or in regional centres. And we thought that we should reach out to our brothers and sisters at the regional level, and hence that's why this meeting is being held here today. I would have to, we didn't know what sort of response we were likely to get, but I would say, just looking at the numbers that are here, that we would judge this to be a roaring success. So thank you very much for your support in being here this afternoon. If you have only just become conscious of the Progressive Christian Network of Victoria and you'd like to support our work, there's membership application forms on the front desk, which if you wish to become a member, you can fill in. Pay your money now or send it in to us, whichever you wish. Feel under no pressure, but of course, the wider our membership, the better we're able to provide services for our members and to advance the cause of progressive Christianity in this state. One of the PCNP doesn't only support speakers, it does other things as well. One of the things that it does is it provides a source of progressive Christian resources, books, CDs, DVDs and so forth. You will have seen as you entered the bookstore at where the books are being sold and told that never to be repeated prices. Low, that is. We didn't put them up for the freight down here. And we invite you to, perhaps at the break, to have a look at what's on the stall, and you will find there titles that you will not normally find in your local bookstore. And if you'd like to support us by purchasing from that store, we'd be appreciative of it. The format of the meeting today is that Greg, whom I'll introduce to you in a moment, will speak for what he thinks is an appropriate time, maybe an hour or so. We'll have a short break, which is an opportunity to stretch your limbs and your backs and get unkicked. And then Greg will continue on, and towards the end of his session there will be a question and answer session. Let me introduce to you the Reverend Dr. Gregory Jenks. He's well known to PCNB. In fact, I think he may be our most frequent appearer at our events, and in fact was the first speaker we ever had back in 2006. So Greg, you're very welcome back with us again. To remind you of what Greg is, he's an Australian religion scholar. He's an Anglican priest. He came to that state of grace by somewhat circuitous, of course. He's academic dean at St Francis Theological College, the Anglican Theological College in Brisbane, which is one of the most progressive of all of the divinity schools in this country. He's a senior lecturer in the School of Theology at Charles Sturt University. He has been visiting professor and scholar in residence at St George's College in Jerusalem, and he is a co-director of the Bethsaida Archaeological Excavation in Israel. He also leads tours of the Holy Land, and in fact he's leaving in about a month's time to lead another tour of folks through the places that you would expect him to be taking you through the Holy Land. He has published a lot. He's a fellow of the Jesus Seminar at Westar Institute. Was once deputy CEO of that organisation in California. His recent publications include the Once and Future Bible and the Once and Future Scriptures, Jesus Then and Jesus Now, and Wisdom and Imagination in conjunction with Greg's Son. All of those titles are available on the bookstore. But he's a distinguished scholar, speaker and writer, one of the leaders in that field in this country, and we're privileged to have him here today. So welcome, Greg. We're glad you're here.
Thank you, Dick, and thank you everybody for the warm welcome. And it is actually a warmer welcome than I expected, which I realise is those boxes pumping out hot air behind me, but I've abandoned my jacket already because it was already becoming uncomfortably hot, even for a subtropical goldfish. It was fairly warm. Greetings from St Francis College in Brisbane, and also greetings from my many, many friends within the Palestinian Christian community in Israel and Palestine, and particularly among those two communities that are very close to my heart, St George's College in Jerusalem, that was mentioned when Dick was introducing me, but also the Christian community in Nazareth, where I have been privileged to spend so much of my time the last few years, that they're starting to think of me as a local. So I guess that's a good thing. It's kind of fun to hang out in the town where Jesus might have grown up as a kid. There's not much from the first century left, of course, but it's an interesting story in its own right. And I'll be particularly looking forward to when my group leaves in a few weeks' time. We're spending 7 nights staying in Nazareth, which is an unusually long period of time for one place, but that says something about its significance to me, I guess. Just a word about the technology. We're trying to record both video and sound from this. The video will be taken care of by itself. The machine will just capture whatever is on the screen. and we're hoping this PA is loud enough that the computer will think I'm standing in front of it. Okay, and if that all works, then there may be a version of this in case you want to go back and look for your favourite heresy at a later stage. The three big ideas that I want to play with today in this presentation, and I'm actually very happy to take kind of questions and conversation as we flow through, as well as having a leg break and a chance to stretch our legs at some stage. The three big ideas that I think I'd want us to be exploring about Scripture. So I want to suggest we read Scripture for the sake of identity, for the sake of orientation, and because we're looking for wisdom. Okay? Identity, orientation, and wisdom. And that it's not primarily about information, and it's not primarily about doctrine. It's not about being right. It's not about being wrong. It's about being formed as people of spirit and people of faith, so that we acquire the wisdom we need to live graceful lives here and now. And I see no particular benefit in becoming experts in the past. Okay, much of what passes for Bible study is, of course, a little bit of ancient history, a little bit of ancient geography, a little bit of ancient sociology. And I love all that stuff, but it's not the point of a rich human life. It's not the point of a life of faith. And I want to suggest it's not the point of why we might want to feel confident and bold even in using Scripture. So, at the core of today's conversation is the reality that Christianity, unlike perhaps most religions, was born with the Bible already in the cradle, because the first Christians were Jews, and by the time Christianity began to emerge, Judaism already had a Bible, and their Bible constitutes 2/3 of our Bible. So there was, in a sense, never a stage in the history of Christianity where the Bible was not already there. Not the Gospels, not the letters of Paul, thankfully not always the book of Revelation, but at least some part of the Bible has always been there in the general vicinity of the emerging Christian community. And so the Scriptures have been there shaping us, influencing us, suggesting ways to make sense of things, suggesting ways to understand Jesus, suggesting ways that we might understand ourselves. And at times they've been understood in magical, almost superstitious ways. In other times they've escaped something of that. But what we're doing this afternoon is to talk about some of the fresh ways in which we might use Scripture and do so with confidence. One of the things which I hope is true of some progressive Christians more generally is that we are interested not just in the intellectual questions, but in the human questions. So how do we make this work? How do we sing the Lord's song? How do we dance the dance? How do we live a life that's actually exciting and worth living for its own sake? So what I want to do in the first part, and I actually had a slightly different pattern in my head as I was preparing, but I think we can still juggle things around fine. I want to use the first part of the afternoon to talk about who we are as we use the Bible and what kind of world we're trying to do that in. And then in particular to focus on how we got the Bible, the Bibles that we have. And then, if we haven't already stopped several times for conversations, I think we will anyway. After a short break, we'll come back. I want to talk a little bit, unpack some ideas about basically letting Scripture free to be whatever we need it to be, rather than the Scriptures being so imprisoned by the needs and the hopes of the church. So let's move in straight on to the first part of the afternoon, which is using the Bible with confidence in our world today. I actually want to begin with us as the reader. The Bible, of course, is the topic, and it's so easy to say, let's talk about it. Okay, let's talk about the book, what we like about it, what we find easy about it, what we find problematic about it. But without readers, any book is just a dead document. Okay? And that's as much true of the Bible as it is for any other text. And so we really need, I suggest, at least start with some reflections about who are we? Who are these people that are putting some kind of value in these ancient texts and making expectations of them, or perhaps feeling that we're under some expectation, we're under some obligation to make sense of the text. So who are we? And I'm happy for this to be a fairly open and iterative process of conversation for us to try and not so much break into small groups, but to actually have a conversation as the afternoon unfolds. Okay. So what I'd like us to start teasing out a little bit about is, who are we? If we can imagine how others might describe us, if anybody else in Geelong had noticed this gathering was happening here this afternoon, what might they say about the kind of people that are here? What are your kids or grandkids saying about you going off to another one of those events? And how do they frame it? What sort of a picture do they put us in? And what do we understand that it means to be genuinely alive and authentically human right here in this situation? So any comments from the floor? I'll be able to repeat your comments hopefully so they get captured by the microphone and put into the audio tape. But what is it about us that makes us interested in reading this book, well, apart from the book itself, or the collection in the book itself? Who are we and why are we interested in these questions? Why did you get out this afternoon, come here to listen to this? Yeah. We're searchers, okay? So we're not simply prepared to sit with the existing patterns of information and wisdom, but we're on this quest for something. Okay? So that would imply open, exploring, eyes wide open maybe, even at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Yep.
About God from what we've been taught in our childhood.
Okay, now I will pick that up and repeat it so that everybody can hear that, and also to check that I've heard it correctly. So we're trying to reconcile and integrate stuff we feel we've always known, some of which we may want to let go of, maybe, with new things we seem to be learning, and new insights, new bits of wisdom, not all of which we perhaps want to keep in the long run, but we've got old stuff which we value, we have new stuff we suspect is valuable, and we're looking for ways of putting them together creatively. And that's us, in some ways. Sort of making it up as we go along. Most of the time feeling okay about that. Sometimes wondering, have we kept too much of the past or not kept enough of the past? Maybe risk takers. We look like a risk-taking crowd. From the guy at the front, how I'm dressed today. Okay. It's not my normal attire, but anyway, it's a work day, so I guess I can come in my uniform. There's someone down here, I think, was sort of had a question I could see that I was sort of about to voice. And so for us this afternoon, for us as a sample of that larger, maybe progressive Christian population, are there things that actually are energising and exciting and life-giving, or are we just drawing the wagons in a circle and defending the assets?
Or even knowing when it is that something is to be treasured in the firm, just kind of getting it.
Yeah.
And other times being quite disoriented because of things that happen in the experience of
Yeah. One of my, we don't need Bible text to justify things, but one of my favourite, I guess it's a parable, it's a kind of a very simple word picture that we find towards the end of Matthew 13. And there's a list of parables attributed to Jesus, and about the last of them is the parable of the householder, the guy with his shed. And the scribe, the scholar who's trained for God's kingdom, is like a householder who knows to go into the treasure place, into the shed, and and bring out just what's needed. Sometimes something old, sometimes something new. And for me, that's a bit of a metaphor of what Scripture is about. It's like God's shed, or at least it's the church's shed. Okay? And there's a lot of stuff in there which, frankly, we probably should have thrown out, but we never listened to her anyway when she said, "Why are you keeping that?" And there's other stuff there that we're glad we didn't throw out, because finally, after many, many years, we've got just the job that bit is needed for. So again, that's the wisdom of knowing what to keep, how to mix and match. And there is no guarantee that the bit of stuff we've been hanging on to will turn out to be the piece we needed. We will get it wrong some of the time, but we'll get it right some of the time as well. And then there'll be the times of celebration. And we have images in the stories and parables about celebration as well. And things that could have been lost, could have been broken, could have been wasted, retrieved, and celebrated. Okay. And I guess, well, I'm sure we're all conscious that the ways that the church operates and the way that the Christian faith is located within our society has changed enormously during our lifetimes. I grew up in northern New South Wales, in Lismore, and rarely get back to that part of the country these days, but occasionally when I get to go back there and have that sense of revisiting my roots, I'm conscious of how I've not only moved a relatively short distance to Brisbane, but I've moved a long way in terms of the childhood, in terms of the way we did stuff in the early 1950s and 1960s. So that's us. We're people who are at least aspiring to be flexible and open and creative, and we embrace the possibilities of new patterns of faithfulness, new expressions of faith, and new understandings of Scripture, but we're not without some sense of discomfort with some of the things that have changed, and some of the changes we've been a part of. So there's one more kind of movement like that I'd like us to explore a little bit, and I'm going to skip over these a couple. We're not going into small groups, but I want to move on to the question of our kind of world. We've just survived a centenary celebration of Anzac, and if the original Anzac was a terrible imperial folly and mistake, I'm not sure that the celebrations avoided much of that same kind of folly in a sense, which is not to diminish the courage and the sacrifice of the people who get caught up in those processes, but it's to wonder why we still allow the people with power to channel the way we think and to channel the way our lives are spent for other people's agendas. So what's the world like for us? And I'm wondering, just to even say in the last 5 years, so if we go back to around about 2010, it's not a long period of time, but even in 5 years, I suspect there's been some significant changes. If you think about how you now spend your life, some of the electronic devices perhaps which are now part of your life, some of your own experience. In a moment I want to shift the conversation to what are we hoping for and what are we hoping to avoid, but let me just keep it with fairly objective things. If you were to imagine where you were living 5 years ago, kind of car you were driving 5 years ago, and the kind of facilities and equipment you had in your house 5 years ago, with your situation now, what kinds of significant changes would you recognise in your own immediate personal space, just in the last 5 years? Yeah, the smartphone revolution Yeah, which was particularly triggered off by the iPhone and then the tablet thing that followed after that with iPad and then the other tablets. Yeah. So the internet at your fingertip, no matter where you go, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and the grandchildren and the husbands that never seem to be able to put the thing away. It doesn't happen to women, of course. It's a boy thing. Yeah. That's really all happened in the last 5 years. It's phenomenal, isn't it? Okay. Any other changes?
Well, for me, being able to watch TV programs I like a few days later because I'm recording.
Okay, and because of iView or other forms of
Well, PBS.
streaming. Yep. Yep.
I'd like to suggest that I don't think we have changed very much. I can remember when I was quite young, there was a little ditty that went. There was a little girl who had a little curl right down the middle of her forehead, and when she was good, she was very, very good. And when she was bad, she was horrible.
Indeed.
And I don't think I've changed much.
Haven't changed that much? Okay. I grew up on that ditty as well. My grandmother used to seem to take great delight in making sure we're all familiar with that particular poem, particular song. Okay. Yeah, the news cycle has changed enormously, and probably where we mostly get our news from has changed, because I think a lot of us have, not only do we hardly get any mail in the letterbox anymore, I still make my daily pilgrimage to the post office box, pay my $100 a year or so to the local post office franchise, but it's almost a rare day now when there's something waiting for me at the letterbox. And so the mail and newspapers, I suspect, have been largely displaced by other forms of media, which doesn't mean we get better information, we just seem to get it coming at us all the time, but not with a lot of depth. John?
Decreasing the face-to-face communication, the text, the email, the data, the
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the ways we communicate have less face-to-face, particularly group face-to-face time, and we're more likely to send a quick text or an email or something. Yeah.
When we become ardent as human beings to the welfare of other people, and I think that the economic sort of theme is paramount rather than the welfare.
Yeah, because 2010 was more or less the global recession as well, wasn't it?
Right.
Even earlier, no, slightly earlier, right, yes, okay. But certainly in that 5 to 7 years, I think Australia has certainly moved to a less compassionate space when it comes to refugees and asylum seekers and so on. And that stands in some contrast to the situation, a decade or two earlier, when there were boat people coming from Vietnam and so on. Very different kind of response. The guy down the front's been waiting to get in, and then we'll come over here. I guess part of that, to take that to a bigger, broader level, would be perhaps to say that particularly the younger generation haven't acquired a story to live by. Now we may think our story is creaking and groaning and has some bits that are broken, but we still have a residual story that to some extent helps us make sense of reality and puts us into the story, and Scripture is part of that, of course. But with the demise of Sunday schools and Christian education and the withdrawal of Christian faith from sort of a mainstream shared values system in our society, I think one of the changes is that we're getting a generation or more of people who really don't have a big story. And that's partly, I think, why Anzac becomes so powerful, is one of the big stories. Okay? It's filling a gap for some of our younger people. Well, they never did get it actually from the standard church. They probably got it from their families. But the families have lost the story. Not just the church has lost the story, the families have lost the story. Let's come down, last one down here, then we'll get across to the Bible.
We've all got older. We can't do physically many of the things we used to do. And I think the social future of the government that is causing people here in retirement to become extremely worried about how they are.
Yeah. Good point. And so we're not as confident as the intergenerational report keeps reminding us that the 3 people left working in Australia when I retire will not be able to pay my pension. And I didn't have 12 kids. So I didn't invest in my own superannuation network as perhaps grandparents and grandparents might have done. And they didn't expect A, to live that long, and B, for there to be a government pension to support them. So yeah, that's a whole new space over which we have little control, but around which can build some anxiety. Okay. All right. So I'm going to leave the next couple of questions, which are things like, what's the best we dare hope for these days? Which could we come up with? Could we come up with 3 or 4 things that we really hope might come to pass? And what is the worst we seek to avoid? And might be an outbreak of terrorism in our local shopping centre or whatever would be one of the horrible things we'd be seeking to avoid. I want to skip that. I'll take this question, but I don't want to spend too much more time at this stage. Let me just, before we move on to the next point, take this last question that's popping up here. So it may well be that one of the positive things is doing something local where we do have some capacity to make a difference. And then in terms of this conversation, one of the fruitful lines would be, so how does the ancient biblical documents, how do those texts feed into and revitalise and support us in doing things locally, whether it's in our street, in our family, in our local community? Maybe that's where, in some sense, part of the future of church lies as a small local grassroots kind of thing. Okay, let me take you on a bit of a walk back through the process by which we got the Bible. Now, I'm pretty confident, knowing some of the people in the room and guessing, extrapolating to some of the others who I don't yet know. I'm sure we all know a fair bit about this. What's in the Bible, 66 books in the common sort of Protestant Bible, 39 or so in the Old Testament, 27 in the New Testament, etc. I want us to talk about more the underlying dynamics and the major kind of milestones of how we ended up with the kind of Bible that we have, partly to check that whether you agree with that reading, my suggestions, and whether that might put us in a better position to think about using the Bible in some different ways. The Christian Bible is often spoken of in the singular term. It's the Bible. We all know what the Bible is. But of course the Bible is actually a diverse set of documents in the first place. And there are many different kinds of Bibles. We're sort of vaguely aware of it, and yet we've tended to operate as if the Bible that we meet in our church, there's one of them, example of it just in front of me here, the revised, it's a reprint of the revised version of the Bible from the late 19th century. We sort of acquiesce in the half-truth that the Bible we use in our church is the same as the Bible they use in all the other churches. Of course, that's not the case. Catholic Bibles are not quite the same as Protestant Bibles. Obviously, a Christian Bible is not the same as a Jewish Bible. Okay? A Greek Orthodox Bible is not the same as a Roman Catholic Bible, and so on. So there's a lot more diversity, but because in the past religion has tended to be practiced in a fairly insular way within particular denominational kind of streams, we haven't always noticed that the Bible is somewhat more variegated than the one that we're familiar with. And part of that, I think, is because the Bible has been, from pretty much when the idea of the Bible first emerges, it's really been an instrument of social control within the lives of communities. The primary function of the Bible has been to keep people in line rather than to inspire people to break ranks and explore possibilities. And I suspect unless we can get to that second option, the Bible doesn't have much positive to offer us as we look at a better human future. However, the social controls which have been structured around the Bible for more than, probably for 2,000 years actually, are in fact collapsing. They're only enforceable now within very small, self-validating circles which you might find yourself choosing to join or being born into, and you may or may not be able to escape. Okay? I grew up in one such an environment. Part of the circuitous route that I suspect Dick was referring to before is that I grew up in the Lismore Church of Christ, an ultra-fundamentalist, very conservative, Bible-believing church. The end result is I know my Bible very well, but along the way there was a significant process of trauma for me as a young teenager as I tried to make sense of it and work out where I was going to locate myself in that tradition, or indeed outside that tradition. And of course, the good news, the big news, and we often don't appreciate just how radical this is that the authority of the Christian religious texts are no longer sanctioned by the state. And one of the reasons people toed the line in the past was because we chopped their heads off or burnt them at the stake or sent them to the colonies if they didn't toe the line. There were real world consequences for not towing the line. Okay? And when we've been watching the horrific footage from the Middle East, of ISIS and so on, which frankly is no more horrific than drones taking out villages, quite often innocent people. Just one's high-tech and one's very primitive. But when people express their quite natural horror at the barbarism being meted out by the ISIS terrorists, I just reply, it sounds like the Old Testament to me. In fact, I correct myself and say, it sounds like the Christian Bible to me. Because the book of Revelation is no less terrible than any of the ethnic cleansing stories in the Old Testament, and frankly the dominant interpretation of the cross is a supreme act of divine violence. So we perhaps often do not appreciate how the the Treaty of Westphalia, 1597, whatever it was, has totally changed the experience of religion in the Western world. We privatised religion. We said it was no longer something for the state to impose and to enforce, and that in our dealings with each other in the public domain, we should treat each other as fellow citizens, not as fellow believers. Okay? And we created a most rare thing in human history, a secular public space. And thank God for that. Thank the wisdom of those who finally were exhausted by more than 100 years of conflict and saw the wisdom of a secular public space. Now the Bible grows out of a world which does not know the concept secular public space. Okay? The Bible is not a modern democratic document infused with the values of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Okay? We choose to read it that way because that's the kind of people we have become, not because that's the kind of document the Bible is. So we are redefining, reshaping, reinterpreting Scripture And the bits we can't redeem, we just kind of ignore, and they don't get read in the lectionary anymore. We sort of retire them, send them to the benches.
Could you give us an example, please?
Of
One of the bits that we don't choose to use.
slavery. The Bible thinks slavery is a fine institution. Why is that so shocking?
No, I'm asking you really, where did you find that in the Bible?
It's encoded all the way through the Old Testament because there are regulations about how to treat slaves. And there's at no point in the Old Testament, in the Bible, is there a condemnation of slavery. When you come across to the New Testament, we find slaves performing functions for their masters in the parables and aphorisms of Jesus. They just go with the turf. Jesus never criticises the social norms of his day, which include slavery and patriarchy. Okay? Jesus, and we look at the later New Testament writings, and we find the household codes in Ephesians and Colossians and so on, which again accept and regulate the practice of slavery, including Christian masters and Christian slaves. And the little letter of Philemon, Paul himself is a participant in the process of regulating slave-master relationships when a slave runs away and seeks refuge with their master's best friend, which provides the slave with a measure of protection. And Paul claims that role vis-a-vis the slave Onesimus. So all through the Bible, from the Jewish parts to the Christian parts, slavery is not only accepted, it's not critiqued, and it is simply reinscribed and accepted uncritically.
Well, I'd want to argue with it because I think those of us who've got enough money to get what we want are in a rather different category from the people who are so poor that they can hardly even buy enough food to keep their family.
Okay, we might have that conversation later. I'm not sure that it's a conversation about slavery and whether or not the Bible endorses or critiques slavery. So let's hold that till we come to a larger kind of conversation space. Certainly the Bible is very well aware of poverty and has, as many people have observed, including Tim Costello, the Bible has hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of verses that address questions of poverty and justice, and maybe 3 or 4 that address questions of homosexuality. And yet that's not what you pick up from listening to the public discourse around the life of the church in our society, where there's little attention to poverty, a lot of attention paid to questions of sexuality. So yeah, these are complex conversations, but the Bible, my broader point would be that the Bible is an ancient document that reflects the values and the human experiences of antiquity. It is not a post-Enlightenment modern document infused with the concept of secular civil space and human rights. Those are foreign, modern concepts that are not part of the Bible. So let's go back to the question then. I'll move on to the question of how does this amazing set of documents come to emerge and hold the kind of position that it has within our churches and our society. The story isn't all that long. It's often said that the Bible goes back, the Bible begins 3,000 years ago or something. That, of course, is not the case. When we're talking about the Bible, I'm talking about the literature, the actual texts themselves. And so the best I would be prepared to concede is that the Bible might have its origins around about 500 or 600 BCE, which means that we've got about 2,500 years of continuous literary activity generating and preserving and passing on the scriptures. There are a number of necessary conditions. Sorry, this doesn't move on by itself, does it? There are a number of necessary conditions for the Bible to exist in the first place. There has to be a society with a sufficient level of cultural development to generate literature, and it also has to be basically a society which has an alphabetic language rather than using hieroglyphics or cuneiform or other kinds of complex character sets. So there are some contingent historical circumstances which actually took place in the Eastern Mediterranean around ancient Palestine and Lebanon, which led to the creation of the alphabet and ultimately the emergence of the kind of literature that we take for granted. That, of course, means there has to be a scribal class, and that itself assumes certain levels and forms of social organisation which generate a surplus, and the surplus can be used to pay for useful creatures like priests and tax agents and authors, artists, literary characters and teachers. Even more importantly, I suggest, there has to be a concept, and this I think is one of the big ideas perhaps at the heart of this afternoon's conversation. There has to be the concept that the events of the past, which purport to be recorded in these documents, are controlling for the future. Because that's a key concept, I think, in the idea of the Bible. You've not only got to have a culture and a society and the technology to create texts, but in order to create Bible, you need to have the idea that this book captures and preserves the past in such a way that it controls and regulates the future. And I suspect that's our core problem with the Bible. Okay, we might want to come back to that idea shortly. There also has to be a sufficiently effective religious authority to define certain books as having that kind of status and to impose those books and to regulate their interpretation. Because otherwise there will be as many interpretations as there are reading communities built around the books. There needs to be the technology to create and disseminate the text. And again, a simple point, but until the invention of the printing press, Bibles were expensive and rare documents. The average Christian home for more than 1,000 years prior to the invention of the printing press would never have seen a Bible, would never have owned a copy of the Bible. Bibles were books that were owned by monasteries and by parishes and by wealthy, powerful people who didn't necessarily read them, but at least they could own one. Okay? The average person could neither afford a Bible nor had the literacy to read a Bible. Okay? The reason clergy are called clerks or clergy is because the clergy person, the clerk, was the man in the village who could read and write. And that's why he led the prayers. It was assumed that the rest of the people in the village could not read and write. And so, in the ancient practice of the English Church, which you can still experience, I think, on Norfolk Island on Sunday morning about 11 a.m, when they do the 1662 Book of Common Prayer Communion service, they do it as per the book. The priest says, "Our Father," and the congregation repeats the line after the priest, "Our Father, who art in heaven, who art in heaven," because it was assumed the congregation could not read. They would echo what they were told to say. And of course we particularly do that still for couples when they're getting married, although that's more to do with nervousness than with lack of literary levels most of the time. Okay. And then of course there has to be a community of readers and listeners. A holy book without an audience is just a museum relic. Now there were some moments in the emergence of this kind of Bible which has that status and has been allowed to tell us that the future of our religious tradition is defined by the past of our religious tradition. I just want to mention about half a dozen moments that I think are absolutely critical in the Bible becoming the kind of book that it is. It's becoming the kind of book that it has been for us. And obviously we could spend the rest of the evening going through these and unpacking them, so I just want to list them and I'll offer them into the conversation we're going to have. For me, the first critical moment comes around about the 8th century or the 7th century before the time of Christ, or the Common Era. And this is when the fragile kingdoms of Israel, or Samaria, and of Jerusalem, or Judea, were coming face to face with the reality of the big boys in town. The Assyrians, the Babylonians, and the Egyptians, and subsequently the Persians. And that's when we get this flowering of religious activity, which with hindsight we call the Hebrew prophets. People like Hosea and Amos and Isaiah and so on, flowing through eventually to Jeremiah and Ezekiel and so on. And in the political crisis of the ancient peoples of Israel and Judah, round about 750 to 600, we find, I think, the first emergence of texts designed to tell a story about the past in order to shape the religious imagination and the political imagination of the immediate audience. And I would suggest that that's when what we call the Bible begins to come to birth. It might be, if you like, the moment of conception. Fast forward a few hundred years, the crisis never goes away. The people of God who have these stories that suggest to them that under God's blessing they should be on top of their game, controlling everything from Egypt to Mesopotamia, but realising it isn't like that, and in their better moments perhaps realising it never has been. So we have this ongoing tension between the reality of living as a community with distinct ideas about yourself and your God in a world that doesn't buy your theology. Because neither the Babylonians, nor the Persians, nor Alexander the Great, nor the Seleucids, nor the Ptolemies, and eventually the Romans bought the Jewish theological agenda. And what the Jewish community was doing was to tell itself stories, to write documents, and to give some of those documents what we would call, with hindsight, canonical status, particular religious significance. So by the time we get well into the development of the Jewish temple state focused on Jerusalem, in the 100 and 200 years or so prior to the birth of Jesus, what we call Second Temple Judaism, we find that there's a general consensus about most of what we would recognise as the Old Testament. Most of those books are now available, along with other literature, to the Jewish people around the time of Jesus and a little bit earlier to the time of Jesus. The most important factor in which books had the status was which books are the priests in the temple reading. That was the de facto canonization principle. If a book is being used at the temple, perhaps we should have a copy of it for the synagogue back in Antioch. Okay, so it's an inchoate, informed process of community consensus as a set of books eventually acquire wide recognition. Come along the emergence of the early Jesus movement and all the other crises of the first century for the Jewish community, including the Roman Jewish war and the destruction of the temple, and the need to sort out that religious text becomes more critical. And we get a divergence between what become Jewish communities and Christian communities, sharing a biblical tradition, but defining their Bibles differently over time. And it takes more than 100 years. One character appears to have played a perhaps unwitting part in making this happen more quickly than it might otherwise have occurred, and that was a wealthy businessman called Marcion, who was not developing unique ideas, but his anti-Semitic ideas reflected a growing hostility to Judaism within Gentile Christians in this early 2nd century. And so his proposal, of course, was to discard the Jewish Bible and just have the Christian Bible, consisting of something more or less like the Gospel of Luke and an edited version of Paul's letters. Enough for a Christian Bible, he said. Marcion gave the early emerging Catholic tradition a run for its money and one hell of a fright. And what he inadvertently perhaps did was that he provoked the bishops to make a decision, and the decision was we need bishops to tell us what to think, and we need to keep the Jewish books as part of the Christian Bible. So the Bible as we ended up, even allowing for some of the diversity between different denominational groupings, is very much the consequence of the crisis triggered by Marcion in the first half of the 2nd century, the Common Era. There were two other major events. In the early part of the 4th century, the Emperor Constantine embraces Christianity, initially as his personal religion, and in subsequent rulers, it becomes the official religion of the empire. Christianity is now embraced by those with power, and they want the Christians to be peaceable souls who stop fighting each other and hold the community, the empire, together. Interestingly, one of the first things Constantine did was to arrange for 50 copies of the Christian Bible to be made at government expense, and one copy sent to each of the 50 most important bishops in the Roman Empire. It's possible that one of those is the Codex Sinaiticus from St. Catherine's Monastery at Mount Sinai. If not, it's certainly from that period in the 4th century. So the emperor and the empire now have a vested stake in Christians agreeing on what is in the Bible and how to interpret the Bible. In short, however the bishop tells you. And of course the final moment in that emergence of the Bible as we experience it, I want to mention at this stage, is the events of the European Protestant Reformation, where one of the big ideas, one of the core ideas at the heart of the Reformation, of course, was that the ultimate authority was Bible, not Pope. Bible, not church. Bible, not clergy. Now, of course, the very success of that Reformation and of that reframing of the Bible depended on new technology, the printing press, and the coercive backing of the Protestant princes, who saw it in their interests to back this novel idea. So once again, we need to have not only the text and the technology and the emergence of a literate class, but we need coercive power in a non-secular world to enforce the authority of Scripture. Okay, now I want to take a break there. There's other things I was planning to move through, but it's already 4:10. We want to take a couple of quick questions, and then we'll stand up and stretch our legs, and then come back by 4:30 to lead into the final kind of presentation. We want to take a break straight away. If I'd said enough to provoke you into firing some questions. You're awake? All right. Okay. Let's take a, say, 10-minute break. So we're back here by just on 4:10 on that big clock up there. So let's aim to be back here by 4:20, ready for the next section. And I belatedly realised I must have stopped pressing these buttons before because I was so engrossed in talking to you. Because of the time, what I think I'd like to do is really just move to the questions. I want to just flick past a few of these, which are more information about things. This is mostly stuff that I'm pretty sure that you would. These are the kinds of questions that we might play around with at the slate stage. Yeah. But I'm conscious we've really only got about 30 minutes left, and I don't want to use up too much of the time that remains while I talk, as I'm more than capable of doing, for hours and hours yet, about the Bible. So let's talk about the things about the Bible that you want to talk about, and if there's something I want to squeeze in, I'll find an excuse to squeeze it in as we go along. Okay, because we've got about 30 minutes before we'll probably have to wrap up and start pushing me back to the airport. Okay, so you're wanting a question or you're wanting somebody else?
I want you to tell us about the second last document.
Well, I want you to tell me about that in a minute, actually. Let's start at that question. Would you, because I have 2 grandchildren, and I have not purchased a Bible for them. The boy who's in year 11 goes to a secular grammar school. The girl who's in year 9 goes to an Anglican, K to 12, supposedly low fee, but don't believe that for a moment, Anglican school. So they get different encounters with the tradition. I would be diffident to give either of them, as when they were younger children, a Bible, because I'm not sure that a Bible is a children's book. I gave their father and his sibling horrific children's Bibles when they were little, and I was a freshly ordained deacon and priest, and the favourite page, of course, was the full colour picture of John the Baptist's head on a platter, which my daughter always took great delight in going and getting that book off the shelf whenever we had a visitor and showing them that picture. And I'm not sure what it did to our guests, but it eventually seared its way into my consciousness enough that I thought maybe she's not quite getting from a children's Bible what her mother and I hope she might acquire by possessing such a book. So it's an interest. It's more than just a moot question. It really is the question of how do we pass on a tradition that means so much to us, to our children and grandchildren. And so would we buy them a Bible? And if so, what kind of Bible or which portion of a Bible? And with what operating instructions, guidelines would we give it to our grandchildren?
I would say yes, but I would say what goes with that is us telling our stories or sharing the stories that are so important to us and the Scriptures. So it's not just reading the Bible, it's engaging.
Sure.
And two-way engagement.
So if we can do it in a way where there's opportunity for engagement around the stories with the child, but that of course is often not the case with grandchildren because they live somewhere else.
Well, but our grandchildren are silly. They know often they're good at reading.
Okay.
And they read a lot of stories.
They do. Even these days, they still read books. Yep.
Well, I like Michael Van these colleague little parables, as bits of the story.
Yeah, because one of the realities is when we say that the Bible shapes our identity because it gives us the big story of the Bible is not found equally across all the pages of the Bible. There are portions of the Old Testament and the New Testament which give us the big story. There's an awful lot of content in the Bible which is minutiae, legal, ritualistic material, or things like the prophetic texts, which are very powerful, but they're not necessarily a narrative, a story that you can kind of absorb. And yet there are nuggets of spiritual wisdom in there. And what does the Lord require of you? But to walk humbly with your God and love mercy and do what is right and so on. These are nuggets of wisdom that how many pages of dense materials one have to plough through before you get to that nugget. Okay? And why, and perhaps part of the answer is, I'm talking to myself as much as anybody else in all this, I guess, is how instead of feeling this tyranny, and this is a book, you must read page 1 and then page 2 and then page 3. What if we genuinely recognise the Bible is of course a compilation of many, many different texts, and it is perfectly okay to do what the lectionary does, which is to dip into selected portions and not to feel that we have to read it like a novel, because that's actually a category error. It's not a novel. It's not a story from page 1 to page 733. It's a whole lot of short stories and other pieces of material which can be appreciated at different times and in different readings. So I guess one of my ways of approaching it is about being selective and not assuming that the Bible is unquestionably a good thing for somebody to read. Okay? If somebody was a little bit disturbed, reading the Bible could actually have quite an unhealthy effect on them under certain circumstances as well. Over this side, yeah.
I come from a Baptist background which would have been similar to yours. What I'm asking you is, as you are now, you say lots of changes have occurred in your life. How much has that Bible-based background contributed to the way you are, the way you see life, and the way you relate to others? What has come from that, shall we say, close, I-believing community that you value? Is that a good enough question?
It's a great question. So just to repeat the question slightly, what has come out of my own personal, very deep immersion in Scripture as a young fundamentalist many years ago, and how does that continue to shape me now? One of the most significant things that I get from my knowledge of Scripture, which I acquired involuntarily, but for which I'm very grateful to have that knowledge, is a deep sense. I know the text inside out. I can usually win Bible arguments with people, which is no great moral asset, but I can usually win, at least hold my own corner in a theological argument that's using Scripture as a key thing. More importantly, I think, and this is why I talked about identity and orientation and wisdom at the beginning, I have a real sense. This is not something which one needs to have in order to be a authentic Christian, but I happen to be a Christian who is deeply grounded in Scripture. So in a sense, it is my imaginative world. Now, I would like to say that's not the only way or even the best way to be a Christian. It just is the kind of Christian I am. Okay? And so you take the boy out of Bible college, but you can't take the Bible out of the boy, kind of thing. I sometimes notice this when I'm driving just out in a car by myself in Israel, and because of what modern Israel has tried to do in naming locations, they of course choose biblical information. So as I get to the Tishbe intersection on the highway east of Haifa, I immediately think Elijah the Tishbite. Now, most of the people in the tourist bus or most of the people in the cars around me aren't having that moment. Okay? But I'm conscious of that. Here I am, I'm driving through the territory of Elijah the Tishbite. I'm in that place. It doesn't mean that I have to believe that every story and legend attributed to Elijah took place, but I'm in Elijah country. When I'm in Nazareth or Capernaum, I'm in Jesus country. When I'm down by the Sea of Galilee, I'm by the Kinneret and so on. So, and for me, because of my particular spiritual formation, which was biblical formation, that just resonates with me all the time. That does not mean that that's the best way to be Christian. It's just the kind of Christian my family created me to be. Oddly enough, my three sisters survived untouched by that process. We grew up in the same family, went to the same church. I caught the bug, they ducked the bug. My youngest sister refers to me as God the Gregory, because I'm the only one among my siblings who really practices my faith. Okay. But so the Bible has given me a mental and spiritual landscape. It's given me the basic lexicon of my faith. And I think as I've come to appreciate the diversity within the Bible, in a kind of unintended way, the Bible has given me permission to disagree even with the Bible and to think for myself. And I think that's a truly biblical position. So I'm often found somewhere between my even more liberal friends who think I'm still a fundamentalist in recovery, and they're probably correct, and my conservative friends who think I've left the Christian church to become an Anglican. Okay. Yeah, good question. Margaret.
I was reading Borg's latest book, Convictions, and one of the things that really struck me in this book was his statement that Jesus is the norm of the Bible. In other words, that's your kind of criteria. I was just wondering.
Okay. I can understand why Marcus would have said that, but I'm not sure I could agree with him that that's, again, that it's the only way to read the Bible. For someone like Marcus, who's then Jesus has become really the defining image for God. I'm a bit uncomfortable with wanting to tell our Jewish friends that everything in their tradition has to be measured against Jesus. So that's internal Christian talk, and at that level I'm fine with it, and it's better than a whole lot of other potential, sort of canons within the canon. The trouble is, what does it mean to say that Jesus is the meaning of the canon? The norm. Jesus is the norm of the Bible, because the Jesus story is itself embedded in Scripture. And we're going to take everything in the Jesus tradition as, for me it's a bit more complicated than that, but I can understand why he's doing it, but I can't impose that on other readers, and I certainly can't impose that on Jewish readers whose experience of God and of Scripture does not have Jesus as the norm. So Alexander Shire, The Hidden Power of the Gospel. No, I don't think I've read it. There are historical answers to that, which he should have been able to read about, but that's okay. Yeah. I mean, I have no problem with it. To me, that's an example I would call a sort of devotional approach to developing a template, a model, and then for a period of time reading the Scriptures through that particular template. End of the day, I still want the Scriptures are bigger than any template, and they have the capacity to surprise us and to confront us, take us places we hadn't planned to go. I've heard another very famous, influential New Testament scholar talk about, the four Gospels, taking the four icons we use for the Gospel and trying to develop a sort of in a sense, reduce each Gospel to one major theological theme. End of the day, I'm not comfortable with that. I think it's too reductionist for the power of these texts to speak. And I think the complexities behind the relationship between Matthew and Mark, for instance, are way more subtle than that kind of simplistic kind of paradigm and template would give us. But what I like about those templates is that they invite us to approach the text with an expectation that a conversation is going to start between us and God and the text. And that to me is what reading the Bible is, of course, ultimately about. And it's not limited to the text, not limited to the scriptures, but it's something one might particularly anticipate being the case when you're dealing with texts which we and many people before us for 2,000 years have accorded these documents special status. So we can come to the Bible, in a sense, anticipating this is going to engage us with religious and personal questions of meaning and how we live and how we deal with what's going on in our life and so on. The Bible, of course, was not written to address those questions. The Bible was written to address issues that were powerful at the time the particular documents were written. But if we come to the text with an expectation, that to me is the point where I would talk about inspiration of the text. When a person of faith, a community of faith, approaches the text with an expectation that we might hear what the Spirit has to say to the church as we wrestle with these texts, then that's when, for me, talking about the inspiration of Scripture becomes highly powerful and evocative. I'm not persuaded that God had anything much to do with the generation of the Bible, the creation of the Bible, in terms of inspiration and all that sort of stuff. But I think the Bible becomes a sacrament, a quasi-sacrament, when approached in that attitude of faith. And it's best done as a collective, not necessarily we can only read the Bible with two other consenting adults, not quite that kind of thing, but I mean, that ultimately it's not a private, personal, individualistic exercise. It can be very personal, and it certainly can have private and personal implications. But it's inherently seeking the wisdom of the community of practice to which I belong, to tap into God's wisdom. And one of the most, the Christian tradition tells us on the basis of 2,000 years of experience, reading these books together with other Christians can be a source of blessing. It doesn't mean you never get it wrong, that you never misuse Scripture or misinterpret Scripture, but that, this is a good and a safe, sacramental, spiritual activity. And I'm much more interested in participating in and helping people read the Scripture that way than in teaching them about the history of the Bible, the history of the ancient world. Even though I love that stuff. Okay? To me, that's an intellectual discipline. We're sitting down, engaging with Scripture and saying, so how do we as people of faith, how do we engage with this text, and how does this text invite us to engage differently with daily life? That to me is the point of the Bible. Okay? And so it's about identity, and it's about orientation, it's about wisdom. I'm starting to preach. Stop. Yep.
I just want to go back to what we were talking about with the grandchildren question. And to say that we give kids books all through their lives, and anything from being at the light, the wishing chair, anything from that to Harry Potter, I think we know, that the kids know, that they're stories, that we're not expecting them to believe that these things actually happen. However, we give them the idea that the Bible is different and that we shouldn't do that with the Bible. And I just think that if we could help the kids to see that again, these are stories, and whereas you can find the goodies and the bads in Harry Potter and so on, you can do that too with Bible stories. So I think that there is a way in which we can engage with Bible stories with our kids. Just by trusting them a bit more.
Yeah. And listening up. One of the things that over time, our argument that the Bible is authoritative has been anchored in a perception that these stories really did happen, unlike other religions' myths, our stories really did happen. But guess what? Veronica? You know, a lot of our stories didn't actually happen. It doesn't make them untrue, it just means they didn't happen. And we find it very hard to say that in church, and to say that about the Bible. And so we keep painting ourselves into a corner out of which it's very hard to escape. And then we wonder why our kids and grandkids say, well, you don't believe that, so why do you expect us to act this way? So, in a sense, we've got to find the courage to talk more openly about the Bible as a wonderful mix of wisdom and nonsense at times. I mean, things that are wrong, even things that are evil. And not allow this idea to get by, that somehow we're claiming something for our sacred text that everybody in the room knows is not true and is not true of any religious text, but they're too polite to point it out to us. So they just put us in the corner as some kind of irrelevance.
Yeah, but a lot of people think it's okay to say that about the Old Testament too. You know, maybe some wisdom, but don't say that about the New Testament. That's often the attitude as well.
Although that's a position that's very hard to defend on all kinds of levels, of course. Okay. So, using scripture, what other questions emerge for you as you think about how you would use scripture? I mean, what do you read alongside of scripture to supplement, to broaden your spiritual reading? Because the Bible is not that large a body of text. And there's a whole lot of the Bible that, frankly, like most of Leviticus and Numbers, and probably a fair bit of Deuteronomy, we're never going to read. A great chunk of, probably most of Ezekiel, we're never going to read. Okay. But we pretend that we love every bit of it, every page is special. But we're very picky, we're very choosy, in fact. Okay. So what are the other texts which you find useful to read alongside of Scripture? What are your actual spiritual texts that are meaningful to you, that you do have by your bedside, or you do have tucked away in places where you sit down quietly to reflect? What else are we reading besides the Bible?
People's stories about their experiences of the spiritual.
So biographies and autobiographies.
Not necessarily a whole book about one person, but even just snippets, you know.
Mm-hmm.
But anything at all that is to do with somebody's relationship with God.
Okay, so spiritual stories, whether they're one anecdote or whether they're several scenes, but stories where other people are actually sharing their own lived experience, whether it's ours or not, but you like to read other people's stories of their faith and how they practice.
I'd rather read that than the Bible, to tell you the truth.
Yeah.
Editorials in the newspapers.
Editorials in the newspapers, okay. So how do you use those? Tell me a bit more about how you would use them.
Reading about refugees in detention, surely there's in the Bible that speak to those kind of issues of human suffering. What God's work for us is about the truth, about the alien in the land, behind the alien, the orphan,
Okay, so I'm lost as to how that links with the editorials. You must read a different newspaper than the ones that I see, who tend not to be very compassionate about refugees and so on. But yes, well, I mean, one of the reasons why it's important to get together, whether you're reading someone else or sitting down with a group of people, is because by reading someone that's got a bigger perspective on the text, you can pick up things like, you won't find a chapter in the Bible on how to treat refugees, for instance, but you will find expectations and observations and examples of how foreigners, refugees, asylum seekers, disadvantaged people, vulnerable people were to be cared for. We might find it in the story of Ruth as a more singular kind of story. And teasing out those issues and saying, how does the book of Ruth inform our practice? Again, at the local level, if we're looking at a refugee action group or something locally to get our local member of parliament to address some of these issues, or the city council or whatever, how will something like the book of Ruth inform and give us the courage to tackle some of these issues? Okay, and so let me pick up on that idea, because one of the sometimes I'm asked by clergy and local deanery groups and so on to recommend study materials people can use, and part of my concern is that I think a lot of clergy have lost confidence in our own ability to actually lead and facilitate a discussion group. We don't need to go to Coorong Books and buy a package off the shelf, especially Coorong Books. But we don't need to go and buy a promotional package, to give us the confidence that we can lead a group. And basically, I was at the front stage, sit down with a group of parishioners and read the paper together and pray about the issues that are coming up in your, even if it's a local free paper that's thrown over the front fence so everybody has a copy of it. Okay? Just take time, in some intentional time, to go through, allocate a couple of hours on whatever, Wednesday morning, go through the issues that are in this week's local paper and ask the question, what might God be wanting our community to do in response to these issues? Or are there things to celebrate? Are there things to organise around? And how might Scripture inform us in doing that? Was there anything in last Sunday's readings or next Sunday's readings that might be informed by this, what's going on in the life of our local community? Instead of thinking we have to have a package with glossy books and a CD or a DVD or something to go with it, what if we actually read the local newspaper with eyes of faith and hearts of compassion, and then prayed for wisdom to see, how does God want this community to act this week? See where it goes from there. So how can we develop spiritual practices around using the Bible that are not assuming expertise and knowledge, but encourage people to read and reflect and pose questions and then come back a week or three later and basically combine some journaling with some Bible reading. It doesn't matter how much you've read. There's no like the good Christians read a chapter a day and the Anglicans read a verse a month. Or are there ways into that? Because what's happened is we've put the Bible on such a pedestal we're almost afraid to get it down and use it. Partly because of perhaps our own lack of confidence, partly because a lot of it isn't self-evidently relevant to our situation, and also because we're busy and we're used to entertainment being pushed at us. Click, turn it on, rather than sit down and, in a sense, create it by engaging in a more reflective process. But I suspect that's part of the recovery of Scripture, is actually forming, and the kind of Cassillo model can be fashioned around that as well, which is small groups, cell groups of 3 or 4 people. That's the covenant to do a bit of this and reflect. Because I think, to me, it's really important. I mean, the Bible is itself a collective document. It's generated by the experiences of thousands of people, even if the actual authors are a relatively lesser number of people. And I think it lends itself to being used reflectively and collectively rather than as a study text. But I think that's exactly, from my perspective, that's exactly the kind of healthy, life-giving way for Scripture to function in the life of Christian community. that it's not about theological argument, it's not about mining for ammunition to use in favour of this argument or against that argument. It's about immersing ourselves in a tradition, and the Psalms are a classic example of that, of course, with the daddy officers. But it's immersing ourselves in the tradition so it almost becomes part of who we are without us even having to think about it. And then at the right time and place, the Spirit presses a button and some of that stuff connects for us. And we can practice that in small groups, like having these informal conversations where nobody's expecting the world-class sermon, but some thoughtful reflections, shared reflections on life and Scripture. Doesn't get much better than that. Yeah. All right, I'm conscious that we're just nudging up to 5. One frowning person disappointed to miss out, so I'm not sure I can justify that I can do justice to that in a one-line summary. But you're talking in this lady talking about the different dynamic when the text is being used and celebrated and lived in that holistic way. Let me just finish then with an anecdote of a similar process happening in a different tradition. A friend of mine I've got to know through a particular academic seminar that I'm involved in called the Biblical Characters in 3 Traditions. It looks at characters out of the Bible which occur in Judaism, Christianity and Islam. And scholars from the 3 traditions meet once a year. This year it's Buenos Aires. Just got to go and do my bit for the cause. And so one of the colleagues I met from this is a Jewish scholar. He was a professor of Western literature at Bar Ilan University, and he's become more of an observant, practicing Jew as he's aged and retired. He goes off to Talmud study every morning of the week. Okay, and with a group of other people, they meet at the synagogue, they say their morning prayers, and they reflect on the portion of Talmud allocated in the tradition for that day. And it's the same process. Gathering around the sacred text with an attitude of faith, of openness, of receptivity, anticipating that the wisdom of heaven will have something to say to them in their concrete historical situation that morning. And then they will do the best they can during the rest of the day and the rest of the week to embrace that wisdom and practice it in some appropriate way. Imagine if people who read Bible gained a reputation for being like that. Okay. All right, let's stop.
Many thanks for that, Greg. Those of you who have been fortunate enough to hear Greg speak before will not have been surprised at the warmth, the erudition, the mental capacity to deal with these very complex issues that were evident in Greg's words to us this afternoon. It's wonderful that a person of his stature is willing to fly from Brisbane and return home just to come and talk to us. Today we're extremely grateful for that. And I hope that you've found, I think you have already shown by your applause, how much you appreciate what he has done and said to us today. So thank you very much, Greg. You're always welcome here, and we look forward to hearing you at some point in the future. But our heartfelt thanks for the effort that you've put into coming and being of great service and help to us. And just as a little impermanent memento